So in this video, let's think about in terms of the function SAT math problem. And the question is in the xy plane, the graph of the function f, which means the f is our function of this question. And it has a x-intercepts at -3, -1, as well as 1. And which of the following can define our function f? And there are some choices right over here that we can pick as our answers. And before we think about our solving for the questions, let's think about solutions of this question at first. So for our first solutions, let's think about what it is to be the x-intercept. And in the question it says it has the function f has the 3x-intercept, which will going to be -3, -1, as well as 1. So if you think about x-intercept, it means the x value exists. I'll just call it x because we don't know exact value of it. And the y value should always be equal to 0. And the question says it has 3x-intercept, -3, -1, and 1, which means there are a x-coordinate, and the y value should be always be equal to 0. So let's think about solving for this question. So in the question says that it had a 3x-intercept, which is -3, -1, and then 1. And we have talked about these terms that they are not a full coordinate. They are just a x-coordinate, which means using this information we can make a full coordinate for more to solve for our question. So, using this pattern with x-intercept, we can actually make a full coordinate. At first, the x value -3, and according to the x-intercept definition, the y value should always be equal to 0. And same thing with the next one, the x value should be -1, and the y value should always be equal to 0, and that's what the x-intercept means. And for the next one, the y value is the x value is 1. The y value should always be equal to 0. And this is what x-intercept means. And we could make a full coordinate using our informations of our x values in our x-intercept. So we can actually solve for this question. So we figure out that in the x-intercept, the x value is -3, x value is -1, x value is also equal to 1, and the y values are also equal to 0. So we can make a function form using our informations that are given. So at first we know that the function is f, and usually we figure out that instead of y, sometimes with the y, also we can replace it as f of x. It is same meaning with y, but we just make it to figure out that are given informations, because the given information said that the function will going to be f in this case. So the f of x is equal to, and the reason why we wrote x is because it is a factor of our function, which means when you input the value of something, we figure out that when you input the value of -3, -1, 1, they gave us a output of our function, which is y, always equal to 0. And that's also what x-intercept means, and that's also what function property means. So f of x is our factor, which means when you input the value, so that is our input of our function, and there will be a specific equation, and that equation will going to give us our output of our function, which will going to be, in this case, the function f. So let's think about solving for this question, f of x. So at first we figure out that there are 3 x-intercepts, so which means the first step that we need to do is we replace every single terms into the x value. And the basic function property is that beside these nomials, there should be a multiple sign. That's one of our function property. And what we did here is replace every single term, which is -3, -1, as well as 1 into the x values to see the value of it. They can make our output of our function, which is f, equal to 0. So for the terms, our first step that we need to do is make every single terms, so make x values of our function, so x values of our function, which is x-intercept, -1, -1, -3, -1, and 1, and there should be a given one, the given x values, and then we make it into a x. The reason why we are doing that is because we want to find the value that makes this expression 0. So at first, the x value is -3, x value -1, x value is 1. And for the beside of binomials, there should be a multiple sign. And that should be equal to 0, as we have learned here. And if this term, if the output is 0, which means this term can be equal to 0, this term can be equal to 0, this term can also be equal to 0. The reason is because we're multiplying something. So -3, in order to make it into the 0, all you have to do is add 3. Here is -1. In order to make this expression equal to 0, all you have to do is add 1. -1 plus 1, 0. Here the x value is 1, the y value, the term that makes this expression 0, all you have to do is subtract 1. So what we are doing here is that we are finding possibilities of the of the terms that makes this output of our function into 0. And we obviously know that our output of our function is equal to 0. So if you write this term down, because it is kind of confusing, f of x is equal to x plus 3 times x plus 1 times, we don't have to write times, x minus 1. And this is our basic function. So if you look at our questions, if you look at our choices for solving for this question, we can figure out that here, -3, we need to have a +3, we can cancel it out. For the next one, neg x minus 1 is satisfied, x plus 1 is satisfied, and lastly, x plus 3, which means B should be our answer for this question. So for the answer of this question, we're going to be B, obviously. Now, if you review the steps that we did, at first, the first thing that we need to do is we write the x-intercept, and then we convert this into a full coordinate, which mean by that is, using this pattern, we made a full coordinate which contains x and the y value, which became -3, 0, -1, 0, and 1, 0 in our equation. And the second step that we need to do is that at first we replace every single terms, every make x values that are given into the x value. The reason why we're doing that, this should be the second step, and this should be the third step. The reason why we convert into the x, even though we know a value of it, is because we want to see a value such as +3, +1, -3, which turn this output of our function equal to 0. So we can think about it in this way. We are trying to find the possibilities that makes this whole expression turn into 0. So, and the next thing what we want to do is, and the third step that we need to do is, after we figure out that we figure out the function values 3, 1, and -1, which makes this whole expression's output of our function. Now the third thing is find the answer of our equation. And these are the steps that we did here. And if you review our function, f of x, we know that f should be the output of our function, and we call it a function. And the reason why we wrote x, even though they gave us just a function is f, is because the x value is a factor of our function. And that means when you input the value of x here, we also need to input the value into x right over here. We are just writing it for convenience. And we figure out that our answer for this question became b. And now let's think about in terms of the function graph of this function. F of x is equal to x plus 3, x plus 1, and x minus 1. The reason is because if you go to more advanced SAT function math problem, it's hard to solve for it if you don't exactly know about the function graphs properly. F of x is equal to x plus 3 times x plus 1 times x minus 1. We can figure out that they're both not linear function or a quadratic function. The reason is because for the linear function, in order to make a linear function, it will going to be a straight line that passes through a specific equation. And it should be only the first power of the x term. And if you think about f of x is equal to x plus 3 times x plus 1 times x minus 1, if we multiply x terms together, it gives us x to the third power. So we can clearly say that it's not a linear. Also for a quadratic, if you graph a quadratic, it will going to be a parabola. And for the parabola, it is the same thing with the second power of the x degrees. And for this term also, it will going to be third x degrees, which will also not going to be a quadratic. So we can think about it will go to be a parabola or a line. That means we will need a lot of points to graph this function. At first, we know some points to graph this f of x is equal to x plus 3 times x plus 1 times x minus 1. The basic coordinate that we use through solving for this question is -3, 0, and -1, 0, and we got 1, 0. And we can plot the points at first. -3, 0 is the x value is equal to -3, and the y value is equal to 0. So 1, -3. And for the next one, -1, 0, the x value is -1 and the y value is equal to 0. So it will going to be right over here. And for the 1, 0, the x value is 1 and the y value should be equal to 0. So if you plot it, it will going to be right over here. And we need to pick more points to graph this function. And if you write our function down, f of x is equal to x plus 3 times x plus 1 times x minus 1. If we input the value of the x value, we also need to input the value, same values, and it will going to give us our output of our function, which will going to be the function f. And let's think about when the case the x value is equal to 0. When the x value is equal to 0, it will going to be f of x is equal to, instead of x, we input 0 plus 3, and then 0 plus 1, and then 0 minus 1, and then 3 will going to give us, and then 1, and then -1. But beside this nomials, we know that there is a times, which is multiplication sign. If you multiply them together, 3 times 1 times -1. 1 times -1 gives us a -1, and then multiply by 3 will going to give us -3. So when the x value is equal to 0, the y value, which is output of our function, will going to be -3. So it will going to be 1 2 3 in the y-intercept. And y-intercept is same meaning with x-intercept, but that means when the x value is equal to 0, the y value exists. And if you pick more points to graph, let's think about when the x value is -2. When the x value is -2, we're going to be f of x is equal to, instead of x value, we input -2, we plus 3, and then we have -2 plus 1, and we have -2 minus 1. Negative plus 3 will going to give us positive 1, and then there are multiplication sign. The -2 plus 1 will going to give us -1. We also multiply by -3, which will going to give us our output of our function. 1 times -1 is -1. Negative times negative gives us positive value, and then 1 times 3 will going to be 3. And that means when the x value is equal to -2, the y value will going to be 3. So it will going to be right over here. So we can't exactly pick some points to graph because it is not a quadratic or a linear, but we can graph we can actually graph a approximate value of a graph, which will going to be something look like this. If you want to graph a exact function, we can just go to a graphing calculator and graph it. So it will going to be something that look like this, that passes through all the points that we picked, and then it will keep going on to our function according to this. F of x is equal to x plus 3 times x plus 1 times x minus 1. So this is the function f of x, and then it is the approximate value of that graph.